Hi, I'd like to welcome you to Real Crusades History. My name is J. Stephen Roberts, and I'm here today with Dr. Andrew Latham, who is a professor of political science at Macalester College and also a historian. And Andrew has written an excellent novel set during the Third Crusade called The Holy Lance. So we're going to talk about that today. So, Andrew, thanks for being with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and it's my pleasure to be here.
So, first of all, could I ask you, how did you become interested in the Crusades?
Well, I was doing a big research project. I actually started a long time ago, and I was, from a political science perspective, trying to compare, trying to trace the way in which war has evolved over the millennia. So I was going to have three case studies: the medieval, kind of high modern, Napoleonic era, that kind of thing, and the way in which war was supposed to have been changing today. And I started off with the first case study, the medieval one, and I never left that case study behind. I just fell in love with the era. I had known very little about medieval things before that. The Crusades are kind of in the ether, but I didn't know very much about them. And just, I guess, like a lot of people do, just fell in love with the era, with the questions, with the issues, with the ideas that were floating around. Um, and I've been hooked ever since, basically.
So, in writing this novel, how did you decide to set it during the Third Crusade?
Well, the Third Crusade, people will disagree over this, which is the most interesting, but this is my personal favorite. Maybe the First Crusade, giving it a run for its money, but when you look at the personalities, obviously Saladin and Richard, but others as well, when you look at the tactical, the operational successes of the Crusaders, especially under Richard's leadership, when you look at the way in which it was a very near run thing, on one interpretation at least, Saladin's empire was a bit ramshackle at the time, and many people would argue, many scholars would argue, that had the Crusaders made one good uh, decisive push, I mean, they made some pushes towards Jerusalem, but a decisive push, not only would they have captured it, but they would have shattered the mystique of Saladin and fragmented his empire, and the world would be a very different place today. Some would argue it would be a better place. I'll leave that to others to argue, but it would be a very different place.
Let's kind of talk about Richard the Lionheart specifically. Obviously, he's a huge personality associated with the Third Crusade. So, what do you think about him as a general, as an administrator?
Well, there are at least two schools of thought, and the dominant one varies over the centuries. And the one is, of course, that Richard was he was the Lionheart. He was a great warrior. He was a great leader. He was the quintessential knight, if you like. He was the almost perfect embodiment of all those knightly virtues and values. Chivalry is probably the wrong word, but something akin to chivalry. And that was the dominant view for a long time. There have always been dissenting voices, but that was the dominant view, really until in terms of modern history, until the aftermath of the Second World War. And then you get people like Stephen Runciman, who writes, at the time it was the definitive study of the Crusades, but it was inflected by the experience, of course, of the Second World War and the genocides and whatnot. And he judged the Crusaders in general, and Richard in particular, very harshly, and set the tone, I think, for the next several decades, in which Richard came across as not being a very good king of England, for sure. The joke about him, of course, was that he was not Richard Coeur de Lion, but Richard Gare de Lyon, reference to the French railway station. He was never in England, more than about 6 months, I think. And that the Third Crusade was a failure. He failed to liberate Jerusalem, and that basically he was cast in a very negative light. And then, the tide turns, the pendulum swings, and we've had now, in the last several decades, several authors, John Gillingham being my favorite, who has really rehabilitated Richard, not only as a warrior, and nobody doubts his courage and his martial capabilities, but as a leader, as an operational general, if you like to use contemporary language, and also, though, as a politician. He held together the Angevin Empire, even despite the fact that he was far away, either in captivity or fighting in the Crusades for much of his career, in a way that John, for example, his brother, simply wasn't able to do. And I think, too, looking at his political biography, which is what Gillingham does, really reveals that that the negative interpretation of him simply doesn't bear much scrutiny, that he really is, in a sense, the Lionheart, not the Richard who was the absentee governor, and not a very good one at that. I'm a big fan of Richard.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know from what I've studied, if you actually read what medieval Latins thought about Richard, especially from his own area of the world, he really was viewed as a great king. It wasn't just like, well, I mean, he's this great knight, but he was a great administrator in their minds too.
That's right. I mean, you have to make some allowance for the sycophantic nature of some of that, and of course, the supporters of Philip of France were putting about negative rumors even while Richard was still alive. But yes, I think you're right. I know you're right on this one. It very much comes across in the eyes of contemporaries who were the closest to him and able to observe him as a warrior and as an administrator, as a great man and as a great warrior and as a great administrator, a great king. I guess is the easiest way to put that.
Yeah, and I'd say probably even the Muslim sources tend to view him that way, wouldn't you
I've been
say?
reviewing those recently, the Crusades, not through Arab eyes, but the Crusades through the eyes of a contemporary Muslim chroniclers. And yes, they feared this man. They feared him on the battlefield, but they also ascribed to him the qualities of cunning in a positive way. It scared them because he was such a good statesman, I guess is one way of putting it. He was outmaneuvering them, and they feared that he always had one more trick up his sleeve. The only time he's referred to in a very negative light is after the slaughter of the innocents, of course, after the fall of Acre, when the hostages were killed. A decision, by the way, which probably made a great deal of sense and was within the norms of the time, but one can understand why the Muslim observers judge this in a very negative light. But it's the only time, really, that I've encountered where Muslim sources really impugn the honor and the effectiveness as a statesman and a soldier of Richard.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so let's kind of talk a little bit about your book specifically here. I know I'm kind of veering away from the preset questions we had, but
That's okay.
so yeah, why don't you kind of just tell us a little bit overall about your book? I mean, it's set during the Third Crusade, but in what parts of the Third Crusade does it follow, and how does the plot kind of, without giving away too many spoilers?
No, without giving too many spoilers. It is set in the Third Crusade. The protagonist shows up just as Acre is about to fall to the Crusaders, so late summer 1191. And this first installment of what will be at least a trilogy takes us up until, but really it's only a few months after that. So it's late August is when it ends. So a few months in the Third Crusade. There'll be at least two more installments, two more novels, which will cover till Richard departs. So we will see most of the Third Crusade covered in this trilogy. And in the first one, it's in some ways a classic quest story. We have a hero, in this case Michael Fitzalan, who's been charged with finding some, in this case it's a religious relic, the Holy Lance, which some contemporaries believed really did have metaphysical, supernatural power. But I tend to think of it as a kind of force multiplier in contemporary terms. It simply was something, without going all kind of Dan Brown, it was simply something that if you possessed it, it would enhance the morale of the people on crusade. So Richard, even if he doesn't buy the religious aspect, he certainly buys the military significance of this particular artifact. And so we see the small band of Templars led by Michael Fitzalan roaming across, deep into Muslim-held territory to recover this lance, which has been hidden away decades earlier. And they face a number of trials and tribulations, and there is no shortage of good battle scenes. I think they're good anyway. Battle scenes. And at one level, that's the way the novel operates. On a slightly deeper level, and without getting too literary about the whole thing, it also traces the evolution of the hero from being a very, very good worldly knight to a very, very good, what St. Bernard of Clairvaux called the new knights, the knights who were using their martial prowess not in pursuit of their own power and wealth and glory and pleasure, but very much in pursuit of the interests of the church at the time. So a new model for knighthood. And I want to trace the evolution of Fitzalan from the model of the old knight into this model new knight, this quintessential Templar. So those are basically the two elements of the story. One, not superficial is the wrong term, but one kind of surface story, which is a classic Cornwell-esque kind of military adventure story, and then a slightly deeper one in which we try to come to grips with what these Templar Knights were really all about. How could they be these pious monks and these brutal killers at the same time? What was the ideological or the spiritual glue that held all that together? I don't think that story's been told very well. And so if there is a kind of deeper point to the book, I think it's getting the truth out about the Templars.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I thought that your character, Michael Fitzalan, was a really interesting character. And, as you mentioned, he is a Templar. And if I remember correctly, he originally was a secular knight in,
That's right, yeah.
In Richard's kingdom.
That's right, yep.
Yeah, so that is really interesting. And I think that, as I understand it, he's a fictional character, right?
He's fictional. I mean, there was a Fitzalan family, and they did have a number of sons, and one of them was named Michael. But there's no. I just did a little bit of research. I was looking for a name that was, authentic and accurate, and I came across this genealogy. But I don't pretend. But then the fiction kicks in. He's fictional beyond that. So his birth date, and we developed a backstory for these characters, and his is pretty extensive, and it's all fiction, but set within the historical realities of his lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for the medieval world, we don't know a lot of specific stories for a lot of minor figures. I mean, we know like the kings and their stories and that kind of thing. So I think that while this is a fictional character, definitely what we're looking at is a life and kind of a series of events that could very much be plausible in this period. So that's one thing I really liked about the character.
Yeah, and I tried, the temptation always is to take a very modern or contemporary hero, James Bond, somebody like that, and plop them back in the 12th century with all these modern sensibilities and all these modern worldviews. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to properly historicize this guy. And you're right, it's a very difficult thing to do because we don't have accounts, as we do of, say, Richard. We don't have accounts of these mid-level or minor nobles. But I tried to kind of reconstruct from what we know about the Templar Knights, reconstruct their worldview, and have him grow so that he was the ultimate Templar Knight. So in this way, trying to create, it's my best guess about what a 12th century hero would look like, rather than plopping a 21st century hero back several centuries and saying, well, look how foresighted he was. He was a secular humanist before it was popular, those sorts of things.
Like Kingdom of Heaven, maybe.
For example, brilliant series, by the way. I thoroughly enjoyed that. But yes, with some minor exceptions, that is a case study in how not to tell an historical tale.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think Helena and her co-conspirator did a wonderful job on it.
We had a lot of fun with that, and I appreciate your endorsement. And I just want to I do want to say real quick here, for me, like you're saying, historical accuracy, especially in the perspective of the characters, is really, really essential for a good work of historical fiction. And that's something that is definitely in your novel, and so I really want to endorse it to everybody who follows Real Crusades history. I really hope you'll pick this book up. It's a really great experience of the Third Crusade.
Well, thank you for that. And I did want to I could have written another nonfiction work and tried to get at these things, but I think fiction is really the best way to get at this, to recreate their world. And so I'm glad that came across.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So aside from your main character, Michael Fitzalan, are there any other characters you kind of want to mention? Maybe some other fictional individuals that you developed, or perhaps
I do. Let me break it down into two groups. The nonfiction, the real characters. Saladin, I've portrayed in a very different light than his worshippers, if I can put it that way, in both East and West today. If you read the sources again at the time, there are two views of Saladin, one of which is that he's this kind of 19th century liberal gentleman, right? This is the city of God. Take on it. And the other one is that he was a devious, conniving, power-grabbing so-and-so. And he comes across in my novel more as the latter. His brother, whom we refer to as Saladin, comes across in a much more positive light. I've cast him as the real brains behind the throne. So that's one character that I enjoyed writing about in a kind of, I won't say counterfactual, but counter-commonsensical way, given the way he's understood today. There are a couple of other characters. One review of the book commented on the fact that there were a number of sergeants as opposed to just Templar knights, but Turcopoles who were native auxiliaries, as you know, and sergeants who were really helpers both on the battlefield and off the battlefield, and they play quite a prominent role in this. I've assigned them some pretty, I think, interesting parts to play in the story. So readers might want to keep an eye out for that. Then there's one priest. He's actually from the hospital. He's not a Templar because that's just, I guess, a decision I made. And he is a very, I guess in literary theory terms, he's a kind of shapeshifter. You never know whether he's really an ally or whether he's an adversary. He's pursuing his own agenda, but it's hidden. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He's an interesting character because he's one of the Poulains, one of the locally born Christians, and he understands the complex, multi-layered, multifaceted politics of Outremer, or the Holy Land. And so he's constantly teaching Fitzalan about those realities, but Fitzalan never quite trusts him, and there's this dynamic tension between the two. And I think as the next two novels unfold, that will be the key kind of interpersonal dyad that I want to develop, because I could make this into a buddy series, as Bernard Cornwell does so well, for example. In the Sharp series, he's got Richard Sharp, and he's got, his name just popped out of my head, his Irish sergeant, and that's kind of a key relationship. And I could do that, and there's a little bit of that in this with Arnaldus de Fonte, who's another knight who is close friends with Fitzalan. But the more I've been thinking about it, the more I think this relationship between the Hospitaller priest and the Templar knight, I think there's great scope for developing some interesting insights into the orders, both of those orders. So those, I think, are the key characters. I like Richard, too, because I'm trying to not turn him into a kind of cardboard cutout comic book figure. I want him to be complicated in all sorts of ways, but I really want him to embody the kind of perfection of the worldly knight, and then to draw a stark contrast between him and Fitzalan, who's this kind of perfect avatar, if you like, of St. Bernard's new knight, and see how that dynamic kind of contrast or tension plays out as well. There are lots of bit players. I have, for example, a Cathar who shows up. This is a little bit before the Albigensian Crusade, of course, but he's a foot soldier and provides some interesting. He provides some interesting insights. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, kind of, if you're familiar with that, Shakespearean characters, kind of, or even the Tom Stoppard take on that, provides just a little bit more of a grunt's eye view, as opposed to, Richard's very stratospheric perspective, or Fitzalan's less stratospheric, but, he's not a grunt. He's not a foot soldier. He's something a little bit more than that. So those are the characters I had the most fun with, and those are the characters I'm most hopeful about going forward.
Yeah, really interesting. So I know you mentioned Saladin. I thought your interpretation of Saladin was really interesting and really accurate, too. Like you were saying, when you actually look at Saladin's history, I do think you get more of an image of, he wasn't sort of like this reluctant world conqueror. He was very much a intensely driven, ambitious politician, pretty ruthless in the way he went about appropriating large segments of the Muslim world.
Right.
And I know you and I have talked about this before, and I know that a book that you and I have discussed is this book by Aaron Kreutz,
right,
Saladin, which there's a lot of very bad biographies of Saladin, but that book in particular really does seem to get at the heart of who Saladin really was. So kind of talk to me about that a little bit.
Right.
Who was Saladin?
That particular book is a favorite of mine. I won't say that I treat it as the Bible, because it's imperfect in some ways, but it was the guiding inspiration, I think, for the way I portrayed him. And when you think about it, when you think about the way in which Saladin re-entered the Islamic world in the 19th century, right? He had been appropriated in the West as a kind of cultural icon of chivalry, and that gets passed down to the generations. And when the European imperialists show up, they kind of reintroduce Saladin to a part of the world, the Muslim world, which had forgotten all about him. And of course, they bring with them this very chivalrous, otherworldly in some ways notion, and that becomes then deeply embedded in Arab nationalism and Islamic political thought and whatnot. So, and then of course that gets re-exported to the West, and we see that in the Ridley Scott film in particular. This notion that he's very much the 19th century liberal gentleman. He's the reluctant warrior. He's chivalrous. He doesn't slaughter the inhabitants of Jerusalem. By the way, he did slaughter the inhabitants of a lot of other cities, both Christian and Muslim. And I think Ehrenkreuz really gets at that. And it's a polemic in some ways. He really wants to trash this simplistic comic book representation of Saladin and bring us the truth, largely via contemporary Muslim sources. Right? I mean, Saladin made a lot of enemies in the Islamic world because he was a ruthless politician. And so, to my mind, if anybody really wants to come to grips with the historical Saladin, not the mythical one, not the Hollywood one, but the historical one, that Ehrenkreuz book is a very, very good place to start.
Yeah, and I don't think Ehrenkreuz was in any way unfavorable in his view of Saladin. I think he actually admired him in terms of his political abilities.
It's a sympathetic take. It's sympathetic to Saladin the man, not to his hagiographers down through the ages who have kind of elevated him into some near saint, really.
Yeah. So anyway, I know we've already kind of touched on the military orders, and obviously they play a huge role in your book. So kind of tell us a little bit more about how the Templars and the Hospitallers fit into your story.
Well, they are these new knights that Saint Bernard talked about, and of course they have different histories, the various orders, but they all kind of embody this notion of a monk and a warrior, and you put those two together, and what keeps that hyphen holding them together? That's the really big question for me. They're also, it must be said, they're simply always popular. In novels, some of which are very good, some of which are very bad, and in film, and in now video games, for example, Assassin's Creed comes to mind. I'm not a fan or anything, but I'm aware of it. And so this seemed to me to be a great vehicle. There were a couple of truths I wanted to get at in this novel. As I said, I did want it to be a rip-roaring military adventure, lots of battles, and I think that's there. But below that, beneath that, I wanted to tell the truth about the Crusades, that they weren't some proto-colonial European imperial project. It was basically a delayed counterattack, and we can go into that at more length if you want. And I wanted to tell the truth about the Templars, who come across in popular culture as either cynical thugs, right, who pretend to be religious but really have the usual earthly motives of power and glory and wealth and pleasure, or religious fanatics. Think ISIS, that kind of religious fanatic. And I wanted to tell the truth about these guys, which is that they were Christians, as everybody at least nominally was. They understood the world in terms of Christian conceptual categories. Some of them, I'm sure, were fallen. Some of them were broken men. Some of them were bad men. But the ideal of this warrior monk, whether it was a Hospitaller or the Teutonic Knights, or, there were a lot of smaller orders as well, especially in Iberia, and really convey in a way that's readily accessible that these guys weren't cynical thugs. These guys weren't religious lunatics. These guys were struggling with big spiritual questions. A lot of them are fundamentally unable to give up a military life. They've been born and bred as knights, as secular knights, to be that way. They couldn't give that up. So how do you reconcile a spiritual anxiety, or however we might want to characterize that on the one hand, which is induced partly by the sinfulness of the knightly life, right? The killing and the overconsumption of all sorts of material goods and things like that. How do you reconcile the spiritual and the warrior? I don't think it's a story that's been well told. I think contemporary Hollywood always gets it wrong. And again, Ridley Scott film is a perfect example of that in some ways. So I'm trying to undo a little bit of that damage in my own modest way, I guess. And we have nothing really like this today, certainly not in the Western world. There are the vestiges of some of these old orders, but they're not what they used to be. And therefore they're very alien, and I think require a lot of explaining.
Yeah, and I think you do a great job of portraying the Templars accurately in this book, so congratulations on that.
Well, thank you for that.
Kind of touching on some of the things you were just mentioning, for me, my go-to source for Templar history is usually either somebody like Helen Nicholson or Malcolm Barber, a couple of the two leading scholars on the Templars. And, you look at their research, and there's really no historical basis for these kind of slanderous views of the Templars, especially not the idea that they were hypocrites, or that
No.
they secretly weren't even Christians. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You
Right.
give up so much to go be a warrior monk in the Middle East. I mean, how could that possibly be?
Yeah, it required great sacrifices. This was largely true of the Crusaders across the board. I mean, they often mortgaged their properties. We know this. We have the mortgage documents, right? It's funny you mentioned Barber because he is not only, along with Helen, he's a go-to guy for me. It's a go-to source. When I finished the first draft of the novel, I actually sent it off to him. And I asked him if he would comment on the historical accuracy of it. He doesn't do blurbs, which would have been ideal. I would love to have a blurb from him on the back of the book. But he said, I don't do those anymore. He retired late 2000s. And I sent him this, and he sent me back a marked up copy, and he said it was very good, very interesting. He liked it. There were one or two minor historical corrections that he caught, historical errors that he caught. For example, Catholic priests have only been called father since the Restoration in England in the 19th century. And
interesting.
That is interesting, right? Because you read these historical, even the masters like Bernard Cornwell, you read 1356, for example, and he's always talking about father this and father that. So I did a little bit of research, and it's true. They were called Dom, short for Dominus or Lord, or they were called Harry or Joe, depending. I mean, but we're not called father. And so in the historic, but I had to strike a balance because these days, of course, that's the default setting for people. It's Father Jones or Father Smith. And I think in terms of readability, I left that in there for the readability. And then in the historical, the author's note at the very end, I said, I do know that this is anachronistic, but sometimes you have to make these trade-offs between historical accuracy and readability and accessibility for the audience. So there's one of those cases where he caught something that would have embarrassed me tremendously had it not been caught. But it felt really good to have a scholar of his stature say, not only did I like it, it was a good story, but it's accurate. He couldn't find any major faults. One or two minor things like the use of father.
Well, yeah, I mean, if Malcolm Barber is giving his seal of approval, I think we can safely say that we've got a really solid novel here. So
that's how I felt, and it was a good feeling, frankly.
Great. All right. Well, man, I could talk about this stuff all day, but obviously I think we need to probably wrap it up.
Okay.
So, Dr. Latham, really appreciate having you, and I'd love to have you on again to discuss some more stuff. So again, the novel is called The Holy Lance. I'm going to be linking to it on this video in the About box, so I do hope everybody will go to Amazon, check it out, pick it up. It's a great read. So thanks again, Dr. Latham.
Thank you.